Gotcha.
Yep.
And we're live streaming now.
And Madam Clerk, we do have a quorum present, correct?
Yes, sir. And I think Councilmember Waring will probably be joining soon. I just sent him the link.
Okay. Well, we can dispense with some of the initial business then. So I'm going to go ahead at 5:12 and call the Ad Hoc Rules Advisory Committee meeting to order for September 8th, originally slated for 5 p.m. And I would appreciate if we could get started with agenda item 1, which is an invocation. And I would just ask for a moment of silence and everyone to keep the royal family in the United Kingdom in your thoughts and prayers, as Queen Elizabeth did pass away this morning. Okay, thank you. All right, next up, we have the approval of the minutes from the June 29th, 2022 initial meeting of the Ad Hoc Rules Committee. Is there a motion to accept the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
All right, it's been moved and properly seconded to accept the minutes. Are there any discussion or additions, deletions to correct anything in the minutes? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. Next on the agenda is the discussion regarding proposed updates to section 2-24 of the Code of Ordinances for the City of Charleston. Does anyone from legal want to take that one?
Sure, I'll take it. I believe the proposed revisions are attached to the agenda. And I'm hoping this accurately reflects our conversation a few months back. But what it is spelling out basically is any council member who would like to add an item to the agenda would first go through council communications as a discussion item, wherein council would discuss, and if they wanted to move forward, they would push it toward the appropriate committee for vetting. The committee would, I believe, advise us to draft an actual ordinance. Jennifer, please jump in here and correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you, there it is. I only have as my cell phone today trying to read these. So here we go. So first, yes, it was started in council communications on the city agenda. Council would direct staff to draft the proposed ordinance. So there we go, to be considered by the appropriate standing committee. So at that point, by majority of council, we would be, as staff, directed to draft a proposed ordinance. It would go through committee and then report it out. And that's where council would have the opportunity to consider it for first reading. And then, of course, if we don't have an appropriate committee to send it to, council by majority could direct us to draft the legislation to bring back at a subsequent meeting. So if you have any additions or corrections to that, please let us know.
So Julia, does that give, in this proposal, does it give your office enough time to, based on this, draft the ordinance? If it comes through communication, you know, obviously I think there's usually a consultation process. Then if it meets the vote threshold, your office would work on drafting it. Obviously with whomever was the council member who recommended it for communication. And then it pretty much just follows kind of the normal process from there. But does that the first portion of that give your office enough time to draft it based on if it comes from communications and then needs to go to committee?
You know, and I think it's going to be on a case by case. Obviously, if it's a larger piece of legislation, we'll speak up during the council meeting and ask for additional time for the, you know, so when you direct us, you tell us to come back at a certain amount of time. I figured if we leave it clean like it is here, it gives you some discretion as council to make those decisions.
Yeah, I was going to say it's because there's not any time frames in there. I think it allows for the discussion to kind of dictate what we think the appropriate time frame would be, whether it's the next committee meeting or it's the following month's committee meeting or that type of thing. You know, so I do think that that's leaving it up to the case by case is probably better than spelling out immediately, because it could be if something did come forward that got added to the agenda on, you know, the Monday agenda meeting, comes to council the following week. I could see where, you know, based on the circumstances going on, that it could be something that needs to happen right away, or it could be something that has time to kind of get mulled over.
Absolutely.
Councilmember Saccharin, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. I missed the first meeting, so I may be asking a question that has already been addressed. But in the bolded underline, it says the City Council may then direct staff to draft the proposed ordinance to be considered by the appropriate standing committee. Is there a vote that we will take?
That's the, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, so I think I can at least answer it. So the idea would be, when it comes to council communication, if it's an item that the majority and will of council feels is worthy of amending the code of ordinances, we would then direct by vote staff to begin drafting that ordinance. And Councilmember Saccharin, just for your background, the idea was to streamline the process a little bit. Instead of 12 of us plus the mayor moving the staff to ask for ordinances to be drafted before there's even a will of council, whether it even wants to be considered. The idea was to move it before the body first, in order to see if there's a will to pursue the topic at hand. And then should the code of ordinances need to be revised in such manner, then the will of council would need a majority vote in order to direct staff to begin that process, because it's time consuming and laborious for the staff to begin drafting those, especially, as I'm sure going back and forth with legal on those, especially for us non-lawyers in the group. So we wanted to make sure that there was a process by which staff could understand, clearly delineated as a law, right? Because this is going to be in the ordinances, how things have to happen, so that there's not kind of the questions of, well, I want an ordinance to be considered by this committee, and so I'm going to, email Julia and ask for this to become type up an ordinance when there's not even any indication that council or a committee wants to consider it. So that was just by way of background. And then I didn't see whether Councilmember Bowden or Mayor Tecklenburg's hand came up first.
Bowden.
Councilmember Bowden.
I think this is a really good policy. I thought about it. It's, kind of I think we talked about a bunch of stuff at the first meeting. But I think this is good because it still allows the committees to talk about the policy before we direct staff to actually draft an ordinance, right? So they can, the committee chairs still have their full purview. They can have the discussion on what they want the policy to be. They can bring the policy to the full body to see, to kind of start gauging whether it's actually going to be worth bringing it up at a full city council meeting, worth directing staff resources to drafting it. And then they'll then have another chance to workshop the actual language of the ordinance before it gets back to us. So to me, this is a really good policy.
All right, Mayor Tecklenburg, then Councilmember Saccharin.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for consistency's sake, maybe you should say in the second sentence of C, a majority of city council may then direct staff, just like you do in the last sentence. Just a suggestion.
Yep. No, is there any objection to that? I definitely agree. All right, without objection.
Okay.
All right, Councilmember Saccharin.
This is just one route for ordinances to get to council agenda, or is this the preferred route? I guess my question is focused on, for example, everything we've got on with HARC right now. Hopefully soon, some of those recommendations are going to start coming to council. The plan is for those recommendations to be funneled through the standing committees. Is this going to circumvent this process, or?
No. So the way from the first discussion, we had kind of talked about 3 ways that things come to council. So this is in no way abrogates the mayor's prerogative as the executive officer of the city to place an ordinance on an agenda, right? So that's kind of one route. But then as things percolate up from our advisory commissions and other bodies in the city, those then end up going to kind of a committee of first instance, if you want to think of it that way. Or they can come to council from those particular commissions or other bodies, because not everything's a commission. And then those can be placed through the mayor's prerogative on the agenda as well. This is for more council or council member directed items that would otherwise be just kind of one-offs that we would want to see come to council. Like whenever we want to, an issue comes up, it could be localized, it may not be, but the council member feels that it's worthy of discussion and then would like to see it get referred to committee. This is the process by which that we can actually spell out what that is, which it was always kind of informal, but based on my experience, I think other members' experience, there wasn't a formalized process and it was beginning to burden staff, which obviously we don't want. And also when a member of the public would ask me like, how does an ordinance get adopted? And I couldn't really tell them because it's not spelled out. So it in no way abrogates the mayor's authority, but this is if it's a council member initiated ordinance. Councilmember Waring.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think in item C, I think the last sentence should be first. Should there be no appropriate committee for assignment, the majority of council may direct, as opposed to a council member may bring a proposed ordinance. The first thing the councilman should do, or the member of council should do, is see what appropriate standing committee this goes in front of. That should be the first thing. Now, if it doesn't obviously, have a standing committee that it would be appropriate, then I guess, you would bring it to council. And then we decide whether, to send it to staff, whatever. But so I like it, but I just think that sentence should be first. And then when we I thought part of this got back to Councilmember Bowden's concern when, the issue came from community development. I think community development met on a Thursday, and the following Tuesday, it was in front of council and, created a lot of, in particular, lack of information for those who were not on when they were right. So how do we accomplish that, Ms. Copeland, an example of something that comes from a committee, an ordinance that comes from a committee, standing committee, comes to giving council more time to, in particular, members who are not, and obviously, well, the mayor's a member of all standing committee, but council members who are not a part of a standing committee to have appropriate time to review and ask their questions prior to it hitting the floor of city council. How does this ordinance accomplish the concern that Councilmember Bowden had? And I think very legitimate. I felt the same way. It was unfair for that to come less than a week to the body of the whole. How does this change accomplish that? Giving more time.
Good question. And I don't think C would prevent what happened.
I don't think E does either.
So we were monkeying around with the language early on after the first meeting, and it got so bogged down that we just scratched all that and started with C. But we might have to add a D here just to kind of talk through that scenario.
Well, let me give a suggestion, one that came up that night. When something passes the planning commission, rezoning, it doesn't come to the next council. I think it's 30 days before it comes to the council. So we, council members have from when the planning commission votes on it, almost a month before it comes forward to council. Now, one of the problems with that is if it's something urgent, that's time sensitive, or even the mundane, that we really don't want to hold up the purchase of a sanitation truck because of that, right? So that's the trick. But I'm just wondering if something can be found from how changes to our ordinance come forward from the planning commission to us. There's certainly ample time prior to it hitting council members' agenda. Can we do something similar when something in particular that's a huge change for the city? How do you define a huge change? And anyway, that issue that came forward from community development created a consternation that more time would have eliminated some of it, I think, anyway.
Well, thank you, Councilmember Waring. And I definitely agree. And I think there's a way to parse some language where we exclude ways and means, right? Because that has to come immediately to council, where we can exclude that, but come up with some language that would allow for, I would call it like a cooling off period, or a review period or something to that effect. But I saw Mayor Tecklenburg and then Councilmember Bowden.
So a couple of things. Your remarks, Mr. Chairman, about the administration's right and ability to, continue to bring things forward as it would recommend. I just question whether we should specify this section 2-24 to be the adoption of council member initiated ordinances, just so a future council wouldn't be confused to think that this was the only way to, bring something forward. So that's one thing. And then I was curious, Julia, it says in A that no ordinance shall have the force of law until it has been read 2 times on 2 separate days. But the way we do it now, we read it 3 times total on 2 separate days, right? Is that correct?
We never focused on A. So you reading that to me, that causes some consternation. That probably needs to be changed as well, considering we have 3 readings. Or you tell me, Jennifer, what's going on there?
Yes, so I think there's a separate portion of the code that addresses 3 readings. I think this is just trying to say that, so it's in the rules that you can have not in this section, but that you can have second and third reading at the same meeting. This is just saying that you have to have at least 6 days in between. So like you can't have a council meeting on Tuesday and then have a special council meeting that Thursday to give it second and third reading. That's all that's saying.
Well, I would still recommend that this be consistent with the way it's stated wherever else you're talking about. It seems to me that it's different than what we currently practice. So I would just look at that other section and make them consistent. Would recommend that.
I would agree. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilmember Bowden.
Thank you. So I guess I have a couple questions. So where it says proposed ordinance, and I think the mayor's suggestion there was very helpful. I agree that we should make this adoption of council member proposed ordinances. But where it says proposed ordinance in section C, does that solve the problem of the things that we have to deal with in ways and means where it's time sensitive? It really needs to be dealt with quicker than sort of the bigger picture policy changes.
I think so, just because it's prefaced by a council member proposed ordinance. I mean, the ways and means proposed ordinances are coming from a totally different source. I think
Okay.
that's answering your question.
I just wasn't sure if those were, technically ordinances or, some other technical language that we, take them out of the definition of ordinance under this section. I'm not exactly sure what language that would be, but
Mhm.
to me, what I had envisioned is like big picture policy changes
Right.
that Ways and Means really aren't.
No, I agree. And I think the exclusion of Ways and Means, as Councilman Brady was mentioning in a second subsection, will help clear that up.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure that we're not going to get in the way of the ordinary city business that we need to be dealing with quickly. And then the other thing is, as I read this section, and I think I've been clear that what I want is the same thing that Councilmember Brady just said, the cooling off period. I think this gets at that at least, and I'm interested in why the community development example wouldn't have been solved by this, where the policy idea that underlies it needs to go to council first before the actual language gets drafted. So what was, I guess, different about that example that wouldn't have been handled by this amendment?
Well, C specifically talks about proposals that are driven by council members, right? Reaching out to staff, asking to get things done. The issue with the fair housing ordinance was that it actually came through the Community Development Committee and came out as a committee report and request for first reading. So it wouldn't have been captured in C. So if we have a separate section that talks about a cooling off period, if something does come directly out of a committee, I think that would capture what you're talking about. Just want to keep it as simple as possible.
And
I think, go ahead,
Sorry.
Sergeant.
Not, Mr. Chairman, I actually found the code section regarding the ordinance, not to switch subjects.
Yep.
I don't know if you want me to pull that up on screen. It may take me a few minutes to get to it on my computer, but it's section 2-46. And it says forms of law, each ordinance to receive 3 readings, adoption procedures. Bear with me one moment and I can pull it up on screen. Okay. Can everyone see that on screen? So this is the code section that addresses how we do the 3 readings of our ordinances. The other section that, I don't know if maybe you want to combine these 2 sections, but the section that we're looking at amending is entitled Adoption of Ordinances and how they are adopted by council. Maybe these 2 sections need to be combined, but this has all the information about how we handle the passage of those ordinances right now. That first section was just saying that you need to have 2 meetings in between, each 2 meetings that are at least 6 days apart, before you can ratify an ordinance. The only exception would be emergency ordinances.
So would it be possible then in the other section that we were just discussing, A through C, would it be possible in A to reference 2-46 and just take out the stuff that talked about the 2 readings and just say something to the effect of following the procedures as outlined in municipal code section 2-46?
We can certainly look at it. That'd be the easiest way.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Just kind of the circle around reference.
Yeah.
Councilmember Waring, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I tell you, Mr. Chairman, I almost forgot what I put it up there for. But again, it was about the timing thing that Councilmember Bowden brought up, because for example, I have something that's going in front of community development about the design corridor review board that's going to be going in September, and I certainly would like to have council members who are not on that committee, to have the appropriate time to kick that one around before coming to the floor of council. I don't think it's that much of a change, but everybody should be aware of what it is now and what the proposal is for the change to be. But anyway, so again, that piece about we're concentrating on things that are doesn't really fit a standing committee. But anyway, when things come from a standing committee, I guess there are times I just don't like. Councilmember Bob brought up a really good point. I mean, a committee that meets on Thursday and Tuesday, everybody else is considering something that they may be getting bombarded about. It'd be great for them to have more time to
So
consider.
could we then, I think, to solve that problem, could we insert something, maybe section D, that mentions that committee meetings occurring within 6 days of a duly scheduled council meeting, any items up for first reading from or referred for first reading from the committee would have to have one council meeting elapse in
Great
between.
idea. Great idea, Mr. I think that's wonderful. That's a great idea.
Sometimes that might be 2 weeks, other times it might not. It just kind of
It'll be at least 2 weeks, maybe the better part of 3.
right.
I think that's a great idea.
But what's the emergency?
I do remember, Mr. Chairman, go ahead. You had a good thought. Go ahead.
I was what's the emergency control though for if something needs to immediately be placed on the agenda, like something passes out of committee, it needs to go direct to council. Do we leave that up to the mayor's prerogative, or is it if it, by unanimous vote of the committee, it can be placed on?
I mean, unless it's some kind of crucial thing, but I don't think it's anything wrong with waiting until the following meeting. I think that's great. Great thing.
Okay.
Oh, I do remember what I forgot. We've been bannering around this cooling off period. I hope that cooling off term doesn't get into the ordinance. I don't think.
Yeah, I was saying the same thing. Right when I said it, I'm like, oh man. But I think it's more than a cooling off period. It's a review period.
I like that. That's what I have written down.
Okay, great.
So just to point out, are there any other standing committees that meet 5 or 6 days prior to a council meeting other than CD? Because I just don't want to draw attention to that and put a target on community development, because that might get some heavy pushback.
If it's just applying to ordinances getting proposed by council members, you just don't want to get annexations held up, because real estate, public works, public safety, they're all going to be meeting before council. And so any ordinances that are going to those committees would be going out in that agenda packet before the committees have actually met. So, I mean, they may in fact end up making amendments at the meeting.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they're all.
I was gonna say real estate is handled under Ways and Means' agenda.
True.
So that wouldn't affect that. But what Public Works is a great reference, Jennifer. How would we handle that?
It would mean that you would have to, if you applied this new rule, you wouldn't be able to consider any ordinances from Public Works at the council meeting the next day. You would have to wait for the next meeting 2 weeks from now. And during the summer, you would have to wait for the meeting a month from then. So that's the only, issue.
Sorry
Could
to
we-
jump in. Would
Oh, yeah,
that
go ahead.
would that be handled by the administration being able to put those things directly from committee onto the? I mean, because to me, those aren't council member proposed. Those are things that come to us from staff on an agenda, and we consider, and then they go onto the directly onto the city council agenda. Those aren't, the types of big picture things that I'm talking about. Those are staff or administration priorities.
So Julia, is there a way to come up with like an elastic clause that's like, I'm just obviously not a lawyer and spitballing, but like something that would say that matters requiring immediate attention from council are exempted, or something to that effect? That's kind of the catch-all, and then it allows for some discretion, kind of like the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution.
Kind of like that, yes. We could come up with something. This is how we got wrapped around the axle trying to think of something creative to address these things that we're talking about here, and that's but yeah, I think there's a way to do it.
Yeah, because I think it's easy to say, exempt ways and means just because it's a committee of the whole anyway. But then come up with some type of elastic phrase that will allow for, things from public works, that type of thing that may need to be considered, that needs immediate consideration to bypass the review period.
And Mr. Chairman, Councilmember Waring has his hand up, but would it be easier just to apply that timeline only to ordinances proposed by a council member? Because if you exempt ways and means, that doesn't mean that, you could have an ordinance that's proposed by a council member that ends up going through ways and means. So even though everyone would be there to consider it, anyway, I'm just throwing that out.
I agree. I think if we try to limit the definition of what would be coming out of these committees, that could be potentially giant legislation,
Right.
Driven by a council member. We can figure out a way to do this with maybe 2 sentences in subsection D. Okay.
I've never known lawyers to be succinct, but that sounds great. Councilmember Waring.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually think what Ms. Cook just said is it, driven by ordinance, driven by council members. I mean, something that comes from the mayor and staff to public works. In my opinion, it's already been vetted to some extent. And then obviously it comes to public works and then comes to council, because we meet on a Monday and, the next day, some of that stuff is hitting y'all's desk. But I've never seen a mushroom cloud, behind something like that, but something that comes from maybe left field, that's my term, from a council member, can create, because nobody knows it's coming besides legal and that council member. So I think what Jennifer said is probably does it. The other things that have been vetted, again, by mayor and department heads, legal, before it even comes to that committee. In most cases, we ask them for legal for the explanation.
Right.
And I guess if we agree, fine. If we don't agree, and the same thing happens when it comes in front of council. In most cases, legal is going to get up and give that explanation to all of us collectively. So I think that does it.
Does anyone else have anything on that? I definitely think you're on to something, council member.
I do.
Give the credit to Ms. Cook now.
Correct.
I guess I would like to make a more general observation, and maybe this is stating something that's obvious. And I support what we're doing here, because I believe, even though we have a strong mayor form of government in the city of Charleston, that council members who would like to propose any idea for an ordinance ought to have the opportunity to regardless of whether the administration agrees with the idea or not. But, you know, somebody can, the other way is for a council member to call the mayor and say, hey, mayor, I got a good idea. You know, what do you think about so-and-so? And, you know, if the mayor agrees, then we can bring it forward, you know, just letting you know. I don't know what Mayor Riley would have thought about this provision right here, Councilmember Waring.
Councilmember Waring, your hands up.
Yeah, he wouldn't have, I'm sorry. He wouldn't have liked that at all. There's no question about it, you know. But I mean, but there are things that for various reasons I don't want to say cross, you just have a difference on, and I'll go back to the 75% rule, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
You had a difference with that. I had a different, you know, council, a majority of council was for it, and we were caught up in something that had us trapped from the late 1930s, you know, all the way to this moment. So, but again, the system worked. I think it took a little while, but it worked.
No.
So yeah, I appreciate your latitude, but I too, you know, when that piece came from community development, I think, Mr. Mayor, you were at that meeting. It was hotly contested in community development. So when it came forward to council, guess what? Same thing happened.
Yeah.
So anyway,
All right.
Councilman Bowden, you had a good observation. Hopefully, I think we're going to be better as a result.
Now, Ms. Copeland, do you have everything you need that's clear as mud to draft what we've been talking about?
So are we still on the same page, despite what I thought I heard what Jennifer Cook just said? And it almost feels like D is not necessary if we're going to keep it just council member driven. But I feel like we need a cooling off period, section D, for things that come straight out of committee. So let me try and
review period.
The review period, right? And Jennifer and I will bat it around with Rick, and we'll come back. I'll send you guys something to take a look at, and we'll see if we can pass muster. And I'll make these other varying changes that were mentioned as well. The title change, the majority of council, referencing 2-46. We'll get all that to you.
Okay.
These are not crazy suggestions.
Okay.
Well, I do
Councilmember.
have one last thing, Jim. I guess it's one last thing. When we fine tune this, how long are we going to give council to look at this before it comes to comes to the floor?
I mean, we have 2 council meetings in September. So, I mean, depending on if we can get a quorum together for this, just to make sure we pass it so we can report out. Yeah, I mean, it could come either the second meeting in September or at latest the first meeting in October.
Yeah, well, my thoughts were, can council, you know, have a couple of weeks to look at it before we even come to.
Yep.
Great.
All right, with this matter having been concluded, I'm going to move on to item 4, which is the discussion regarding a consent agenda.
Ooh.
So at the last meeting, we had discussed the concept of including a consent agenda on the council agenda so that items that are generally not, or I should say, items that generally would pass with unanimous support, the minutes, things of that nature, could be dispensed with in the agenda rather than have them be completely separate line items. Understanding that the consent agenda process, if any member objects to an item on a consent agenda, that item may be pulled out for separate consideration.
And who decides what goes on the consent agenda?
In most of the other boards and commissions I've served on, it's usually defined what types of items would go on. So like we would define that the minutes of council would go on there. You know, if there's generally, like when I was on a board of education, appointments would usually go on there, appointments to boards and commissions. Because again, if any member objects that wants something considered separately, that can be pulled out from the consent agenda. But those are generally the things that don't have, tons of discussion or anything like that. Councilmember Waring?
I've been on boards and things that had that in it, but usually those are kind of private situations. The only thing that I think would go on our consent agenda, almost uncontested, would probably be, as you said, the minutes or maybe bids and purchases. But because of the public input process, I don't know that we can put a half a dozen things. And in the experience that I've had, it's usually been a CEO that, and his the executive or the C-suite that determines what goes on the consent agenda. So for example, if you had a finance committee, okay, the finance committee report is sent out to the board members, and that would be on the consent agenda. If no one had any questions about the finance committee after reviewing their boardroom packet, a board packet, that would be on the consent agenda. But if there was one item on that finance committee report, you can, as Councilman Brady said, you can pull that out to discuss that item, but the remainder of the report would go forward. So, but when I look at the city council agenda, as I say, so much of it is really for transparency to the public. There'd be a couple of things on there, but beyond bids and purchases, which is kind of like automatic, we vote on it. Again, the minutes, we vote on it like that. But I don't know that on city council agenda, you may be able to, I don't even know if you can put, you'd have to eliminate the report because real estate is part of Ways and Means. You may be able to put Ways and Means on there, but real estate is part of that. I don't know. The public input part, I think gets kind of lost in the consent agenda thing. And I think it's a good idea, but when you look at the items that are not automatic and requires public input, I think that kind of hampers city council and the items that can be placed there.
All right, thank you, Councilmember Bowden.
I've been trying to pay really close attention to the things that may have been included in some sort of consent agenda since you proposed it. And I think it's a really good idea, except that I think we move so quickly through them as it is, that in consideration of limited staff resources, I don't see it as something that's totally necessary. And that's, and that's really my only input, is that this just seems like something that is, maybe in a perfect world we could combine, but not being able to, sit here and enumerate the things that should automatically be included in there that we all agree on. It's just, I hate to burden legal with one more thing, considering when we meet on Tuesday, we'll probably give them 50 more things to deal with.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm fine scrapping it. And I definitely agree, Councilmember Waring, that I mean, we could technically move Ways and Means in there, but I think just from the flow of it, and there's also, have been moments where we've had Ways and Means that people will reserve what they're going to say for city council and whatnot. So, I mean, I don't necessarily think that would be included. The thought was just to, where we could on the agenda, speed up, just because, we're not exactly the United States Senate. Like, we're not the world's greatest deliberative body. But some of their committee meetings they go shorter than ours.
They're not the world's greatest deliberative body either, no matter what they like to think.
But yeah, I'm fine if we want to just table this item and reserve it for another time if and when council so decides.
If I may comment, since we're talking about it, just based on Councilmember Waring's example of like a finance committee, and a lot of our council business is hearing the reports from the different committees, standing committees, and but oftentimes there are a number of items coming from each committee that aren't really even voted on necessarily. They're just reported on. And so I think for transparency's sake at council, it's important to have those reports given for the record that, we talked about whatever topic it was. And so I do kind of question how many items we could come up with. And I'll make the other observation that, of course, I think when I go through the agenda meeting before each council meeting in my own mind, like what items, will easily go through. And, if I were selecting the things that I would put on a consent, agenda, I've been wrong a number of times since I've been mayor, and both ways. There'll be some items saying, "Oh my God, we're going to talk about that for an hour," and it passes, and nobody says something, and then something that I think is like a no-brainer and everybody's going to pass, we end up, having a long discussion about it. So I got to tell you, my experience is it's pretty unpredictable.
I mean, we can just appoint Councilmember Seekings in charge of combining all the things that should be combined, and that generally seems to work.
Gotcha.
All right. Well, I'm happy to, without objection, we can just kind of set that one aside for again, at such time that council may decide to take that matter up should it come forward again. All right. With that, I don't have anything else. Does anyone else have any matters to come before the ad hoc rules committee before we adjourn? All
Well,
right.
I brought up a couple other things, but I got to be frank. I missed lunch and I'm hungry, so I'm running out of energy, man.
I will tell you, Councilman Waring, on your conflict of interest question, I have a memo drafted for you showing how
great.
our code reflects state law and what all the other surrounding municipalities and counties are doing as well. So you can compare.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll send it to you.
Okay,
and
well, I
everyone
mean,
else
you
can.
can share it with everybody. I hope.
Oh, yeah. Everyone will get a copy of it for sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good meeting, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Copeland. And thank you everyone for your input and taking time on a Thursday evening. And I will get with Madam Clerk and Madam Deputy Corporation Counsel on scheduling the follow-up meeting once we have the language that we all talked about, and we can get this thing to council soon, hopefully.
Who are you rooting for tonight? With your wife rooting for the Bills?
The Bills are my AFC team, so that's fine.
Hey, I bet if they write this thing up, you can just send it back to this committee as a consent.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
All right. Thanks.